many here remember the last time, and Jim Hugh was here with us, the last time we had Creation Ministries come and share on a Sunday morning? How many? There's only a few I know. Okay, there's a few that were here the last time Creation Ministry. And since then, we had the whole COVID thing. And there's a lot of new folk who just have not heard of Creation Ministries. This ministry has been significant in our family, has been significant in part of our teaching, and really establishing ourselves on the Word of God. If we get the Genesis 1 to 11 count straight, everything falls into place after that. It really does. But if we get that mixed up, then it's really hard to explain the rest of time and humanity that brings us up to today, to 2024. We were praying last night, and we know that we live in a time where there's strong teaching throughout our educational system that we have evolved. But we encourage you to open your heart to the biblical account, to God's account of the origin of man. And so today we're going to be sharing about that. And then after we share, there's resources. You probably saw the table filled with resources on the way out. So don't rush out. Stop by. Those resources are tremendous. We've picked resources up over the years. They're tremendous for you to pick them up. And there's stuff just to enhance, even like material like answers to creation, answers regarding the story of Genesis and our beginnings, our origin. And so there's all kinds of material to help walk you through in a more systematic. If you're like me, you like to study it, and encourage you to do that. A few years ago, it was actually at the beginning of the pandemic, just at the beginning, Lori and I took a trip down to Kentucky, where strategically we went to the Ark. There's a replica Ark, Noah's Ark kind of thing. It's not really his Ark, but there's a replica down there. We went down there. We took our son-in-law, who actually got saved through the ministry of Creation Ministries, and our son-in-law and our daughter and the four of us went down. We spent a weekend. We went to the museum. There's a creation museum down there, and then there's an ark that you can go through. And it was just so educational. And so somebody said, we should make a church trip sometime down there. Wouldn't that be interesting? So we'll see if there's gravity to that. But we are welcoming today. I just want to introduce him. He has been here before, but I want to introduce him again. Jim brings a scientifically up-to-date faith-building message. He travels across churches in our nation. Jim is a Harvard graduate BA. He is also an MA from the University of British Columbia, a Diploma of Theology from Ottawa Theological Hall. He has written extensively, including articles published in several technology journals, a historical romance novel set in Spain during the early Reformation period, serialized a commentary on Genesis 1 to 11, and he's a part of a congregation just in the greater city here. Jim and his wife Lillian live in Scarborough. They have 6 children, 11 grandchildren. The last time Jim was with us, his daughter was with him. He was just explaining this morning that she can't come. She's working with another person who has mobility issues. But we are so glad to have Jim back with us. Would you welcome Jim back again? Jim, bless you.
Thanks, Wayne. I have to wake up my computer. Good. So what I'd like to do today is to contrast biblical creation with evolution. And as Wayne was saying, in our secular media and in our schools, there's such a pressure to push evolution into your thinking. So I'm hoping that we can counter that to an extent today. When you look at the evolutionary view of man, you get something like this, where Stephen Jay Gould, who was a professor at Harvard, he says, mankind is a fortuitous cosmic afterthought on the bush of life. And this individual's still alive, Richard Dawkins, a very outspoken atheist, although a month or two ago he referred to himself as a cultural Christian, which is an interesting contradiction. But he says we live in a universe which has no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So when you take these views, others like Bertrand Russell and Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking, and the list is endless, according to them, we are just a bag of chemicals. And when you start with that foundation, a foundation of evolution, then basically there is no cause for morality, because we are just the result of our genes, and the genes are the result of chance. But if you start with the foundation of biblical creation, a rhetorical question, think about it for a moment. Why did I put biblical creation below God's word? Isn't God's word the most important thing? Think about it for a moment. But in Genesis 1 to 11, and Wayne, you made reference to Genesis 1 to 11, in those we find basically everything we need to know in seed form. There is marriage there when Eve is brought to Adam. There is a morality, and when God says you shall not eat of a particular tree. And remember, Adam didn't need the 10 Commandments yet because he was sinless. So there's one command that God gave him, and he broke it pretty quickly, didn't he? There's a meaning for life in Genesis 1:26. Many theologians refer to that as a cultural mandate. Mankind is given dominion over the creation. There's the gospel in the midst of the curse in Genesis 3:15. So all that we need to know in seed form is right there in Genesis 1 to 11. Now, why did I put biblical creation below God's word? Quote with me the very first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Do you notice that the first thing that God says about himself is he's a creator? Then in verse 3, and God said, the second thing he tells us about himself is that he's a communicator. Creation is the foundational doctrine. It is there from cover to cover in the Bible. In Revelation, you are worthy, O God, to receive glory and honor. Why? Because you created all things. In the middle of the Bible, in the oldest book in the Bible, which is the book of Job, when the supposed friends of Job are giving him their medicine, what does God respond? He says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? He declares himself to be the creator. In the book of Psalms, Psalm 103, Psalm 8, Psalm 104, and on, God declares himself to be the creator. In the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, he defends himself against the idols as the creator, cover to cover. It is the foundational doctrine. So let's assume for the sake of discussion we agree. God is the creator, and we have a Christian worldview. We are against some of the things that are going on in our governments today, such as medical assistance in dying. And Mr. Trudeau continually harps on the topic of abortion, for example. And those things are problematic for Christians. But we find with CMI, Creation Ministries International, that there are two real problems that we encounter in the church. One is that people believe in the universe being 13.8 billion years and the earth being 4.5 billion years old. And the other is that God used some form of evolution to bring us into where we are today. So when the church follows the world with a topic like evolution, the result is that people end up exiting the church. For example, one chaplain at a U.S. university said first-year students, about 80% of them claimed to believe in God, and by their second year, we're down to 15%. And the reason is that they are hearing everything from evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology, evolutionary cosmology, and so it goes. And so often, when surveys are done, the primary reason that young people leave the church is that they're not getting answers to the questions they have about God as the creator. Now, thankfully, Wayne is concerned about it. He's preaching from Genesis. He brings us in to do Creation Week or Creation Sunday, and so you will get the right message about the Bible. But here's the kinds of questions that people ask. And we have a book out on the table there called our Creation Answers book. And it has something like over 60 different questions that you can ask of yourself and then get answers to. You don't have to read the book cover to cover. These days people say too long, did not read. And so you don't have to read it cover to cover. Just go to the topic you're interested in and you'll get a concise, good overview. So there are many professing Christians, and I suspect that some of you that you have questions about how God created things like the flood, the ice age, where the various people groups fit in, and those kinds of things. When I began having an interest in this, I was in high school. I attended Sir John A. Macdonald Collegiate down on Pharmacy, south of Finch, and a friend of mine invited me to attend a speaker. His name was Whitcomb, and he wrote a book, Morris and Whitcomb, together called The Genesis Flood. And since then, I have just consumed literature related to evolution and to creation. I took many science courses when I was in university. In fact, I took them multiple times, not because I failed the exams, but I worked in the science center and for 4 years in our university, and I was able to take the same courses over and over again because I had to put up the videotapes and set up the experiments and everything. It was great. I didn't have to write the exams, but I got to take the courses. So there are questions. And by the way, much of what we present these days has only become available in the last 20, 25 years. The information is astounding that supports the Bible and undermines evolution. Notice, by the way, I used the word support. We do not say that we can prove the Bible is right. It's the Holy Spirit convinces us that the Bible is right. But we have lots of support from science and from history. The evidences support, they don't prove. The Holy Spirit proves it to our hearts. But I've used the term evolution. Let me define it. And I'm going to give you, if you get nothing else out of this, get this definition down, because it is fundamental to understand what is the problem with evolution. And it's not a definition that I've created per se, although I've summarized it. But all of life, according to evolutionists, began, let's not worry about pre-biological evolution. Let's just start with biological evolution. All of life is started with a single self-replicating cell. And that cell, most scientists will tell you today, let's say a bacterium can't be a virus because viruses need a host. We know that from COVID. But bacteria, self-replicating, can reproduce, can move around, and so on. The simplest has roughly 480 genes, roughly. What has been happening according to evolutionists is that genetic information has been increasing through time. And if you look at all of the leaves on the tree, those are all of the species of plants and animals and single-celled creatures and so on throughout the entire world. The information has been increasing, and by the time you get to the human genetic information, we are talking somewhere in the realm of 20,000 genes. So we've gone from roughly 480 to 20,000 genes. And what has happened is that some species, kinds as well, have died out. And they're found only in the fossil record, or post-flood they're found only in historical accounts, or a few skeletons like the dodo bird or the great auk that was in Newfoundland, those kinds of things, or the saber-toothed cat or the woolly mammoths and things like that were around during the Ice Age. And then there are the branches in which there are no evidences of fossils in it, and this is not a term we invented. Evolutionists invented the term missing link. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould, who I quoted from, was concerned about the concept of missing links, and he developed a concept called punctuated equilibrium as an attempt to address it, the missing links. Here's Lynn Margulis. She's no longer alive, but listen to her definition. Every form of life on Earth, oak tree and elephant, bird and bacterium, shares a common ancestry with every other form. So all of life has come out of that original single cell. Information increasing. This is not information increasing. This is decreasing. When you breed specialized dogs, they lose a breadth of genetic information. If you want a robust dog, you want a mutt, bringing multiple strains of genetics together. I tease one of my sons and daughter-in-law, Claudia, because she's of a Chinese background, and I say, look, you've brought two completely different strains of genes together, and Charles is really robust genetically. He's also the smartest kid on the planet, according to his grandfather. This is not evolution either. The dog's breeding, you're removing genetic information. By the way, just on that, we know that what happens when you interbreed, like take the European royal family, too much interbreeding, and there were often genetic problems. So we know it's not, there's a decrease in information. Now this tea was found in China. It's a standard black tea, like an orange pekoe tea, and it's caffeine-free. I think this will become a bestseller someday, but it takes something on the order of 7 years before a tea plant, you can pick a single leaf of it, and to breed enough of this is going to take some time. Why do plants have caffeine? Tea, coffee, cocoa, plants have caffeine. Well, caffeine is a pesticide. I noticed a number you were drinking your coffee cups when you came in. Did you know that you were drinking a pesticide? Now, we drink it in fairly low quantities, so it doesn't poison us. And by the way, I did have a cup of tea before I drove up here. But you notice up on my, hidden up there, where it says methylene chloride, which is used in paint and nail polish remover as a solvent, is one of the key ways that they decaffeinate coffee and tea. If you drink decaffeinated coffee and tea, you're probably ingesting worse chemicals than caffeine. Now, there are other ways that they do it, and another one is equally egregious as a chemical to remove caffeine. So, notice what The Economist says, though, about this particular plant that is caffeine-free. They say it has lost the ability to synthesize caffeine. It's the enzyme for caffeine. Now, caffeine, the caterpillars that eat it will die. And the Economist here says that it's lost its ability. Now, notice what word they inject there. Evolution. This isn't evolution. This is devolution. It's a reduction in information. It has lost its robustness. It has lost genetic information. It's lost the ability to protect itself. That's not evolution. This is a bait and switch technique that you see constantly in the literature. They put in the word evolution when they're talking about mutations or like bacteria. There's antibiotics, and yet the antibiotic-resistant strain already existed, but they call it evolution. No, evolution, according to their own definition, is increasing information through time. We declare at CMI that God, according to his own word, says that he created in 6 natural days across the space of a week. And we say that he did this based upon Genesis 5 and Genesis 10 and 11, leading down to Abram and then connecting us down to 586 BC with the destruction of Jerusalem. We can use those chronological markers. We declare that God created 6,000 years ago. At this point, people's heads explode. There are many people who would say, do you really believe that God created only about 6,000 years ago? And I would say emphatically, yes. Just keep that 6,000 in mind and don't start throwing tomatoes at me yet. So what I'd like to do is give you 5 reasons for believing in biblical creation. First, I just want to do a quick summary of why we accept Genesis 1 as history. And I'll probably spend the most amount of time on this because if we don't get this right, we have a problem. Second, very briefly, death is a result of Adam's sin. You'll see the connection when we get there. I just want to then sweep through some challenges in biological evolution that evolutionists have trouble explaining. And then very quickly, a few pieces of evidence to suggest that the world can't be billions of years old. I'm not going to deal with cosmology today, just the world. And then a few facts to support the flood. Now, appreciate that I have to go at a very high level here. I have 13 different talks. Every one of these topics I could go on quite a while on. So I've got to be very concise here. On the left-hand side is the evolutionary sequence. If you read Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, and Carl Sagan's introduction to it, they both tell you that there was nothing, and then there was a quantum ripple, and then plasma, and on we go. You know the story, or you may have heard it. On the right is the account right out of Genesis 1. Just follow along. Now, you'll notice that the lines are not lined up, and they contradict one another. Just as an example, on the 4th day of creation, everything other than the earth in the cosmos was created. The sun, the moon, the stars, the galaxy was created on the 4th day, but the plants were created on the 3rd day. You can't line these two accounts up. There's a basic law in logic called the law of non-contradiction. And if two ideas contradict each other, at least one of them must be false. They could both be wrong, but at least one of them must be false. Let's see if we can determine which one of these is false. So one of the things that many people have attempted to do is to rationalize these through all kinds of theories. Gap theories, framework hypothesis, overlapping days, and so on. One of the claims is Genesis 1 is poetry. Just let's approach that one for the sake of discussion today. The natural reading of the text is that it's narrative. And one fellow did a study on the verb forms in the Bible, the Hebrew verb forms, and he showed that in narrative sections like 1st and 2nd Samuel, the verbs are formed differently in Hebrew than in poetry, like the Psalms, different forms. And he analyzed the verb forms in Genesis 1. And overwhelmingly, statistically, the verb forms in Genesis 1 are narrative verb forms, not poetic. And also, we know how Hebrew poetry is structured with parallelism in ideas. Directly, one verse will have the idea repeated. Genesis 1 is not set up structurally as a Hebrew poem like the book of Psalms. It's also presented as part of a historical chronology, starting from day 1 all the way down to Abram, and connects us up at the rest of Genesis. It's just treated as part of connected historical account. And God tells us that he created in 6 days, and he did this to set a pattern for the week. Universally in the world, people recognize a 7-day week. In ancient Egypt, they attempted for a period to get rid of the 7-day week. In communist China, during the French Revolution, during the Russian Revolution, there were attempts to get rid of the 7-day week. Some went shorter, some went longer. Every time it failed. Why a 7-day week? It doesn't fit with any natural cycle. It's because right at the beginning, God instituted 6 days of labor and a day of rest, and we need to follow that because it's built into our Constitution. We also have in Hebrew this concept of a consecutive and. And when you see that, these are events that are occurring one after another. And God did this, and God said, and God. And that's what we see as we go through Genesis 1. It indicates a temporal historical set of events. We also have the use of the ordinal. Although day 1 is cardinal, day 1, the rest are second, third, fourth, and fifth. When you get to the passages in Numbers 7 and 29 where the offerings are presented, and they go way beyond the seventh day, those offerings are presented using the ordinal. There isn't a theologian on the face of the earth who would tell you that number 7 and 29 aren't natural days, and yet they try to inject in Genesis 1 that they are not natural days. And God tells us they're natural days. Each day has an evening and a morning. Now, don't fall for the canard that some people will say, well, how can there be an evening and a morning when there's no sun? That isn't what determines evening and morning. It's the spin of the earth, and God created light on the very first day, and the earth was already spinning. It had an evening and a morning. We would say morning and evening, by the way, because we follow Roman reckoning, but we understand it. And then in the Ten Commandments, God actually says that he created it in 6 days, and he sets the pattern for the week. If God didn't create in 6 days, and he's only using it as some form of analogy or something, then it falls apart. He did what he did in 6 days and rested on the seventh to set a pattern for us. And we don't want to accuse God of lying in the midst of the Ten Commandments. And then Jesus places man's creation at the beginning. Now, it's interesting. I have one little fellow. He was probably about 6 years old. He comes up to me afterwards. He said, Mr. Hughes, you're lying. What? He says, no, Adam wasn't created at the beginning. He was created on the 6th day. Quite an astute little fellow. And the rest of the Bible treats Genesis 1 as history. Just one example. By faith we understand the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Now, again, don't fall for the canard that people will raise. Well, Adam was made out of dust, and Eve was made out of his rib. Yes, but God tells us that. The rest of it, God said, and it was. So it's incredible how difficult people make it to, in their attempts to overcome the straight, plain sense of Genesis 1. God created in 6 natural days, one right after the other. And I'll tell you this, if we do not accept Genesis 1 the way God communicates it, then why would we believe in the virgin conception? Why would we believe in the resurrection? Because the foundational doctrine is that God is the creator, and he can create this universe instantly if he chose to do it. Second topic, much briefer. Death is a result of Adam's sin. At the end of the creation week, the very last verse of Genesis 1, God saw everything that he'd made, and it was all very good. Now, during the week, he'd said it was good, it was good. This, he says, it's all very good. But if there has been millions of years of evolution, if we go to the divide between the Precambrian and the Cambrian, we're talking about 540 million years. If we go back into the Jurassic and the Triassic and so on, we're talking about 65 million years where the dinos are supposed to have gone extinct. What do we find in the fossil record? Death, decay, destruction, disease, carnivorism, and so on. There is no conceivable way that you can declare that to be very good before man comes on the scene in an evolutionary thinking. Adam's sin brought death upon mankind and on the living creatures, nefesh kaya in the Hebrew. He brought death upon them, and he brought decay into the universe. And Paul tells us that the whole universe is groaning, waiting for its redemption. And he traces that right back to Adam's sin. So every single fossil must have been created after Adam had sinned. And of course, the bulk of them were created in the Genesis flood. Paul makes an interesting analogy here. He sets it up in 1 Corinthians 15. And basically it is, because we have a historical Adam whose historical sin brought death and decay, therefore it needs to be countered with a historical Christ whose death and resurrection conquers sin and death. If you don't have a historical Adam, according to Paul, you do not have a historical Christ. The two are so intertwined. The first Adam is replaced with the last Adam who creates a new humanity in Christ. If you want to pursue this topic further, we have a TV program called Creation Magazine Live. We're in our 10th season of it. These episodes are half an hour. They used to be broadcast actually on TV stations, but CRTC regulations make it very difficult for Christian material to be broadcast. So you go around it in all the channels, like you can get them on YouTube, for example, and on our website. Pursue it if you're interested. Third topic, quick sweep through so-called biological evolution and the challenges. Let's assume for the sake of discussion that we have the basic building blocks of life. They cannot have evolved by chance. I won't get into that right now. Today, I have another presentation called Chance and the Origin of Life that I deal with chemical evolution and then biological evolution. But let's assume we have the building blocks. Those building blocks are called nucleotides, and there are basically 4 of them, and they're made of phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogen group. Did you know that your entire DNA, every piece of it, has sugar in it? So you're all sweet. So it's made up of those 4 nucleotides. Do you know how many nucleotides are in the human genome? 3 billion of them. And the problem isn't if we have the hardware, which cannot come into existence by chance. The problem is the software, the information that's built into DNA. And that has to be strung together in meaningful information, or we get absolute chaos when cells try to manufacture new proteins. And to Paul Davies, a physicist, he said, how did nature fabricate the world's first digital information processor, the original living cell? From the blinding chaos of blundering molecules, how did molecular hardware get to write its own software? So I'll make you a wager. $1 million, I'll probably have to sell my house in Scarborough, $1 million if you can bring to me your cell phone and say, look, it just wrote its own app. We know hardware doesn't write software. It simply doesn't. And yet, biologists don't have thinking hats when it comes to evolution. Hardware does not write software. It takes intelligence. Anything out there that says made by God, it is DNA. But let's take it up a level. Actually, before I leave that, do you know that DNA can be read in both directions, producing different proteins? You try to write a sentence that can be read in both directions. Try to write one, well, in a word, Hannah, for example, race car. Here's an example of a palindrome written in English. Now, I appreciate it may sound risque as I start it, but once I finish it, it won't be risque. There was a young man, and approaching him was an absolutely gorgeous, naked woman. And he went up to her and he said, Madam, I'm Adam. You can read it in both directions. You guys didn't laugh at that. All right, too serious. Okay. But you try to write sentences both directions. DNA, 3 billion nucleotides, and depending on what proteins are needed, you can read it going in different directions. God put a huge amount of information into DNA. So, how did cells get nucleuses? If you'd like to confound an evolutionist, just ask him that question. How did cells get nucleuses? They have a theory called cell capture, but they have no empirical evidence to explain it. In the nucleus, there is DNA, a double helix, 23 chromosomes in the nucleus. Let's take it up a level. How did cells learn to talk to one another? In the human body, we have roughly 250 different kinds of cells. You've heard of them, like brain cells, blood cells, stem cells, skin cells, and so on. We have roughly 250 different types of cells. How do cells learn to talk to one another? If you get a cut in your finger, immediately electrical and chemical signals are firing off, and, oh, guys, I need some coagulant over here, and send it over real quick. And then I need some subdermal cells, and now I need some dermal cells, maybe a hair follicle, and so on. How did cells learn to talk to one another? Let's take it up a level. In amoebas, they clone their chromosomes, and then they split and become two. That's called asexual reproduction. How did sexual reproduction come into existence, where one set of genetic information comes from the male and one comes from the female? And even if you had a life form that had the male genitals and components at the same time in the same place, one would have to come into existence that had the female components. We're talking astronomical, impossible odds. And the Bible has the answer. He created the male and female by their kinds, not 37 genders or whatever it is today. When Darwin wrote his book, he made a confession, and he said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive flight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Well, Darwin published on The Origin of Species in 1859. He knew nothing about DNA. DNA was, the decoding of it was occurring 100 years later in the 1950s when Watson and Crick were using X-ray analysis of the double helix of the DNA. 100 years later, Darwin knew nothing about genetics. Mendel was doing his research in his monastery in Germany growing garden peas, and he published about 5 years later in the 1860s, and nobody paid any attention to what Mendel had written until about 1900. So we're talking roughly 50 years, 40 years after Darwin had published. You know how important genetics are today, and it's only been in the last 120 years or so that anybody knew anything about genetics. Darwin knew nothing about the complexity of life. When his view was a cell was an amorphous mass of protoplasm. That's the word that they used in that day, protoplasm. No, and we now know that cells are incredibly complex machines. And just one example, the E. coli bacteria has a propeller, and it's made up of a set of proteins. And if all of those proteins are not there, that bacteria is going absolutely nowhere. If you don't have the filament, you can rotate as much as you want and you're not going anywhere. If you have a filament just hanging there without a rotor, it's not going anywhere. Darwin didn't know anything about this. To be blunt, Darwin was ignorant. And his own confession in his book indicates that because you cannot get incremental change to bring about life, then his own confession, his book is meaningless. So take it up a level. Do you grow garden tomatoes? Anybody grow tomatoes? Yeah. Do you know what you need to have pollination? Everybody's looking to slide, oh, we need bees. Well, no. The typical European honeybee was brought over from Europe. Well, it also goes into the Middle East, but it was brought over much, much later. The bee you need to grow tomatoes is bumblebees. Bumblebees are native to the Americas, as are tomatoes. Never understood why in Italy tomatoes have become a primary dish when they're actually originally from the Americas. But the bumblebees. Do you know why you need bumblebees? Actually, if you grow greenhouse tomatoes, they actually ship in to commercial greenhouse growers. They ship in through Canada Post a cardboard box that has bumblebees in it. And they open up a little door, and the bumblebees fly around to the greenhouse, and they pollinate the tomatoes. Why do you need bumblebees to pollinate tomatoes? Because bumblebees are the only bee that hums while it works, and it hums at a perfect middle C. And when it hums at a perfect middle C, it vibrates the yellow flowers open for pollination. Evolutionists have a real tough time explaining symbiotic relationships. Wayne, if you invite me back in a year or two and I ask anybody here what they remember, it's only the bumblebee. They're going to remember. So take it up one more level. Human languages. Languages are very complex structures. And we have built into us the ability to learn languages. Not native language already there, but the ability to learn. A child can learn multiple languages without any difficulty because we have built into us the ability to learn languages. We know instinctively how to parse sentences and how to understand verbs and nouns and so on. Now, the interesting thing is that older languages are more complex than newer languages. For example, if we take English, as you work up, say, not the Saxon side, but you go up the French side after 1066, the Norman Conquest, the French language is more complex than English. One of my daughters teaches English in Quebec City, and right in the very heart of the old Quebec, in what used to be a convent. It's actually the oldest elementary school in North America, originally founded by the Ursuline sisters. And one of her little girls said to her, Miss Hughes, how come in English we don't have, like we have in French, vous and tu? Well, we used to. If you grew up on the King James Bible, you know that that kind of concept was there. Languages are actually decaying through time, and French is more complex. You go back to Latin in the Indo-European family of languages. Latin is more complex. Greek is even more complex, and it's an older language. You go back, say, to Sanskrit, which is a very ancient language. It's even more complex. There's also been a common vocabulary decline. It is estimated that at the time of William Shakespeare, the average native English speaker could use, not just comprehend or understand, but use roughly 30,000 words. Today, the average native English speaker can use roughly 15,000 words, and the average teenager only 100. The attempts were made, say, in the 1700s, maybe in the 1800s, to look for the common original proto-language. They no longer do that. They talk about bushes of languages because there's 50 absolutely distinct, at least 50 distinct language groups. They can't explain this. Well, roughly around 2200 BC, a whole bunch of languages suddenly appeared, and they all, not all, but many of them had written form, like cuneiform, hieroglyphics, symbols, like the Chinese language, and alphabetic, which many attribute to the Phoenicians, but it was probably the Hebrews that invented the first alphabet when they were slaves in Egypt. So all of this suddenly appears. Well, where did these come from? Well, Genesis 11 gives us the answer with the Tower of Babel. Again, Genesis 1 to 11, foundational in terms of our understanding. Human language actually confirms the biblical account because there's decay, not increasing information. The earth can't be billions of years old. One example, well, I've got a few here, 3, I think, or 4. In our cells, not all of them, but in many of our cells, there's 2 parts of DNA. In the nucleus, and then there's this thing called the mitochondria. And in the mitochondria, which is the central processor for the cells, the manufacturing, sends out the signals to actually run it. Also is the electrical generation. In cells, it's called ATP, but it's essentially electricity, and it manages the manufacturing process going on inside the cell. There is a ring, not a double helix, of DNA. It's roughly 16,600 nucleotides compared to 3 billion, 16,600, and 39 genes compared to 20,000 genes. In that mitochondria DNA, not double set like the chromosomes, we only get it from our mothers. We inherit it from our mothers. And every human being on earth has essentially the same mitochondria DNA. But interestingly enough, there are 3 distinct strands of mitochondria DNA in the human population. Do you know where they come from? From the wives, not from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but from their wives, because we get it from our mothers. And we have no background in what they were like or anything like that, but you can say, and we don't know which one mapped to which, but one of each, every person on earth is descended from one of Shem, Ham, and Japheth's wife. And imagine this, there are 3 basic strands of mitochondria DNA in the human population. Now, the studies were done to see how many mutations are occurring. Now, appreciate that there were some mutations before the flood because original mitochondria DNA came from Eve, and some mutations occurred, and we have 3 basic strands. Now, since the flood, mutations have continued in the mitochondria DNA. Now, a study, I should back up here on the Russian Romanov family. A study was done looking at various strands of the human population where we know a great-great-grandmother, and we know her female descendants all the way down. And one of the examples was the Russian Romanov family. So I'm inventing this scenario for simplicity, but pretend that we had a hairbrush in a museum in St. Petersburg that was put there in, say, 1850. And we can take a hair strand and we can get a DNA sample of the mitochondria DNA. And we know who her granddaughter is. And Gibbons, writing about this in the magazine journal called Science, says evolutionary studies led them to expect about 1 mutation in 600 generations, 1 every 12,000 years. Now, why that? Well, they figured that Homo sapiens has been on the earth for 300,000 years. If you divide that by the number of mutations, well, that's where you get the date. But they were stunned to find that 10 base pair changes in the ring had occurred, which indicated that there's roughly 1 mutation every 40 generations, or 1 every 800 years. And she went on then in the article to say mitochondria DNA change rate is too rapid to support evolution. Now listen to what she then said, and you can look up the article. She said measured rate indicates that mankind has only been on the earth for 6,000 years. Pretty amazing. She then went on and said, but nobody believes that. Another piece of evidence that we haven't been on the earth long is that something called genome decay. John Sanford, who was a professor at Cornell University, leading geneticist, as an individual probably has more patents in genetics than any other person on earth. There are companies, of course, that have lots of genetic patents, but as an individual, he became a Christian later in life, and his whole worldview changed. Actually, I have a copy of his book out on the table there. It's called Genetic Entropy. But he indicates that in every generation, mutations are added to the human population at the rate of roughly 200 mutations per generation. And now I'm talking primarily the nuclear DNA. I should have mentioned that in the mitochondria DNA is quite robust compared to the nuclear DNA. So if you have children at your breakfast table, you have mutants sitting there. And you all know that, right? So it's accumulating. Now, many mutations appear to be benign. Like if you have a paragraph and you're trying to understand it, and there's a typo in it, most of the time you can understand the paragraph. Occasionally, mutations are quite deleterious. For example, you have a 3-letter word, in this case it be made up of the nucleotides, but pretend I'm using alphabetic characters, and it said G-O-D. And then somehow they got flipped, and now it's D-O-G. Suddenly it means something quite different. And so they're deleterious. The interesting thing is that John predicts that in roughly 300 generations, the human population will go extinct because of the genetic defect load, which he calls genetic entropy. We're roughly 200 generations since Adam, roughly 200. We don't have to worry. Christ is going to take care of this because we have the promise where in Genesis 9, out of Genesis 1 to 11 in Genesis 9, that God will never again destroy the human population. You see how important Genesis 1 to 11 is? All these things are there, right in the middle of the covenant, which is symbolized by the rainbow. Another piece of evidence was Mary Schweitzer published an article in the Smithsonian, that's the magazine of those museums, and she found soft tissue in dino bones. Oh, after it was published, there was a hue and cry. It is impossible for soft tissue to be found in dino bones because it would have decayed long ago. In fact, we know that organic material decays. You look at labels in your refrigerator, your medicine cabinet, and your pantry. Best before dates. I haven't seen a best before date of 65 million years. So, this is an example of that those dinos could not have been buried 65 million years ago because the organic material would long ago have decayed away or calcified. Many finds since then she continues to publish and other scientists have published. One further example. The Earth is a giant magnet, electric current going around the Earth. And that magnetosphere protects us from cosmic rays, and also animals use it for guidance. And it's been estimated that in the past 1,000 years, based upon looking at the magnetic moment taken on by pottery, which has little pieces of iron in the clay, and using the same firing techniques today, that the Earth's magnetic field has decayed by roughly 40%. If that decay rate continues, then in roughly 1,000 years from now, the Earth will no longer have any magnetic field, and the poor sea turtles will keep going in circles. Birds won't know where to go to nest, and we'll all be fried from cosmic rays. And, you know, it's interesting. A secular journal says our planet's protective shell isn't quite what it used to be. Over the past 2 centuries, its magnetic strength has taken a nosedive, and nobody has the foggiest idea why. That's not true. I know why. Because the Earth isn't old. It's just tired. And it is decaying rapidly, and because the Earth isn't old, there isn't enough time for evolution, which wouldn't occur anyway, but there's not enough time. Some evidence to support the account of the flood. Mass extinctions. There isn't any geological phenomenon or climate phenomenon today that you can use to explain how mass extinctions occurred. The flood is the best example. Worldwide sediment layers. Massive amounts of sediment laid down during the flood. Do you know that if you line up Brazil and Africa, the sediment layers are very similar, they're essentially identical, up to a certain point. About 150 days into the flood, God started to separate the original single continent, and then some additional sediment variations occur. If you'd like to pursue that, it's a book published by the Institute of Creation Research called Carved in Stone by Timothy Clary. And it's amazing. He was a geologist in the oil industry, and he has access to all the core samples, worldwide core samples of sedimentary rock. And he's able to actually describe what is happening layer by layer as it's being laid down during the flood. The Grand Canyon was not carved by the Colorado River. The sediment layers that were laid down were still not solidified into rock, and as the water is rushing off of the new split-up continent into new forming ocean basins to take all that additional water that had come up from the fountains of the deep opening up through roughly 25,000 volcanoes, spewing all kinds of hot water into the air. All that water had to go somewhere, new deep oceans, and as it's cutting through the soft sediment, the Colorado River eventually follows the path of least resistance to the sea. And then we have an example in 1980 when the Mount St. Helens exploded, and all that sediment and slush came washing down. And notice how in a matter of hours it laid down sediment layers that look very similar to what you find in a canyon. And you can see way down there how the scale with a lady standing there in the red jacket or shirt. Within 5 years, that was turning into rock. Rapid sediment deposition. You cannot explain using current techniques how if something, a footprint or a ripple mark or a leaf or a living entity didn't just rot away or get washed away if that sediment is laid down slowly over millennia. It had to have been laid down pretty quickly and in a form that wasn't disruptive. If you're interested in, we have 2 books out there. Michael Ord is author in both, but he wrote the one with Robert Carter. The one is called How the Genesis Flood Shaped Our Earth. The other is called Geology 101. And in both of those, Michael Ord explains how this phenomena could occur during the flood. Also, if you look at canyons, the layers are razor thin. There is no evidence of erosion or soil formation, and if those had been laid down over millions of years, we should have that evidence, and it's not there because they weren't laid down over millions of years. They were laid down rapidly over a space of about 150, 200 days during the flood. We also have tree trunks through forests of petrified trees running through multiple layers of sediment. If they had been, those sediment layers, some of those would be organic material because they're often found in coal areas. The tree trunks would have been eroded away long before the next sediment layer, and these are found worldwide. There's something like 50 petrified forests. You can't explain phenomenon like rocks twisting and bending without it being soft in hard rock won't. So, we have this. I have been communicating a huge amount of material. Even if you were taking notes, you're not going to remember this material. I never look at this so much as education, as more enthusiasm, excite you, get you encouraged in your faith. Sorry to use alliteration there, but I like alliteration. In Peter, he says, in your hearts honor Christ, the Lord is holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone asks for a reason for the hope that is in you. Now do it with gentleness and respect. So, can you defend biblical creation to your Christians who are questioning it or to your neighbors who don't know anything about the Bible? So, we have resources. One of them is every Friday we send out an email, and we have about 30,000 subscribers in Canada. If you would like, sign up and you will get our latest publications, articles, videos that we've posted. If you sign up today, you can take one of the 3 paper sleeved DVDs that are there. If you purchase something, anything, then you can take one of those DVDs. But you don't have to do anything. Just fill it in and we'll get you on our mailing list. These are excellent books. The Faith Building Pack, The Christianity for Skeptics, is an apologetics book of why we are Christians and the challenges that atheists, Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, and so on have in contrast to Christianity. And then our basic book, the Creation Answers book, which I've already mentioned. If you were to get nothing else, get a copy of the Creation Answers book because it really is a helpful book. We keep it up to date constantly. I think we're in our 9th edition at this point on it, and we are always making additions and changing to make sure we're current. Evolution's Achilles' Heel is written by our PhD scientist. In the challenges with evolution, I've just given a very brief overview of those challenges. An accompanying DVD, Jonathan Sarfati, who has a PhD in chemistry, he also has a good background in theology, and he brought them together and wrote a commentary on Genesis 1 to 11. And if you would like to subscribe to Creation Magazine, we've been publishing it for 46 years now. It's the original creation magazine, and it's peer-reviewed very carefully, and it's done quite well from a production standpoint. It costs $7.50 a quarter. We don't charge anything until we ship a copy, and then we just charge $7.50. And these days, just mailing it has got to be close to $7 these days. Example of articles that I just scanned. And if you subscribe today, this is like buy the vacuum cleaner, and I'll throw in some additional vacuum bags. If you've subscribed today, make sure you fill in both sides of the form. You can take a free gift, which is a copy of the magazine right now, and any of the DVDs that are on the table near the entrance. There's some near the entrance to the building. There's some DVDs that are just outside. Those you can't, because we have to pay royalties on those. There's a children's pack for kids maybe like 10 years old, that age group. There's Creation Answers book, which is equivalent to the adult one. And we have a Genesis Academy, which has 12 lessons. And there's an instructor's guide. It's great for a guided discussion, men's fellowship, women's fellowship, teens, that kind of thing. And you can also go to our channels. We have all kinds of stuff on media channels. And you don't have to pay a penny for a lot of this stuff. Creation.com is filled with useful materials, videos and articles and calendars of events. And what's interesting about it is that it's got to be the simplest URL to remember, creation.com. Can't be any simpler than that. So in the church today, there's an undermining going on in Christian universities in some places, in the seminaries in some places, and sadly from some pulpits that are undermining the Genesis 1 to 11 account. We need to get our guns lined up, and everybody needs to get behind the biblical creation account as God describes it in Genesis 1 to 11. Thank you.